So, hello everybody, I'm Fredrik Nystro. I'm a senior consultant in internal medicine and also professor and head of internal medicine at Linköping University, which is about 200 kilometers south of Stockholm in Sweden. So I'll give a brief presentation similar to what Anders has given you on the epidemiology of smoking and nicotine in Sweden, and then I will present a trial of mine that I did that apparently evoked quite a lot of interest all around the world because it tested the acute effects of snus on metabolic markers or metabolism. So these are the pretty much similar, perhaps a bit more detailed changes in snus or nicotine usage from snus and smoking in Sweden. And I think the background pretty much for this possibility for this change to happen was not only, as Anders stated, governmental regulations and so on. It was actually that when we entered the European Union, we were able to get an exempt for the ban on snus. Otherwise, we wouldn't have entered into the European Union. And actually, I think it's, for me personally, perhaps to some extent, interesting historical background. It is that we tried hundreds of years ago in Sweden to grow tobacco, but the quality was so poor, so you couldn't make any cigarettes from it, apparently. So you just ground it up and put it under the lip. And we've done that for more than 100 years. And even where I live then in the Linköping area, they did grow tobacco earlier on of that poor quality. So that's sort of just necessity to get hold of the nicotine historically in Sweden. That was by using snus. That was cheaper for us than to import cigarettes or tobacco of higher quality. And the Swedish snus, the loose snus that Anders talked about, which was the only way you could use snus earlier on, that was formed with your fingers, and it was pretty nasty for most of us. I remember it having tried it twice, being a student in Uppsala, and I vomited all over, and that was both occasions, and my wife forbid me to use it any times more. And that was because you swallowed it. It was so difficult to put these particular loose snus in a way that worked under the lip. And that has been replaced, as Anders said, with pouches nowadays. And it's really, first it was, and it still is to some extent, tobacco pouches, which is non-fermented tobacco. So it's pretty much just pure nicotine, that too, but it has more the taste of tobacco, and that has since changed to more pure white snus, as we call it, which is nicotine pouches. And that, I really think, exactly as Anders put it, it has been the basis in also together with governmental regulations that makes it very, very difficult to smoke. It's impossible to smoke in hospitals, it's impossible to smoke in schools, and you can not even smoke outside of restaurants anymore. So it's difficult to smoke, and people who really like nicotine and the effects of nicotine, they tend to choose these tobacco or in particular nicotine pouches nowadays. And you can't even see it anymore. Earlier on you could recognize a snus user by his really brown teeth and also his sort of bulging upper lip. And you can't see these nicotine pouches anymore. They're just too thin for that. So people can use nicotine without anybody knowing, even surgeons, while operating. I know lots of colleagues that are surgeons who use nicotine, and I had no idea until they told me. So that's a big change, and I think that's important for this, in particular, as Anders put it earlier, in men, the decline in smoking and pretty much small increase in nicotine usage from pouches and to some extent regular loose snus. And the women are not quite catching up to this large difference in smoking rates as men, but they are on the path to replacing cigarettes, the blue lines with the more orange-like snus use or nicotine pouches. And this is up to 2022, and I think that the trend is going the same way. As I've heard, 2023 was even better, and we're going to get the figures for 2024 later this 2023 figures will be released later on this year, and we'll see if we're going to hit really prevalence less than 5%. But a good thing is that you can see here, if you look at in Sweden, in younger people, they really smoked a very, very small proportion, less than 5% already. So that's really good according to these figures. And the other thing, I think it's interesting to see that we have another country that's not part of the European Union that also have had a tradition to use snus, and that's Norway, to the west of Sweden, and they have exactly the same trends. So again, you see they've switched smoking to snus use also to a large extent. It's really interesting. So there's sort of two experimental settings, one in Sweden, one in Norway, and they show the same strong trends, really suggesting that allowing snus will help you to reduce smoking, because people just like nicotine. Some of the people really like it. They feel more focused and alive and sort of, yeah. Doesn't work on me, but it works on some other people. Apparently to 20%. I get nausea. And that's actually of interest. That was one of the reasons why I did my trial, which I'm going to present now finally. And that is the appetite suppressing effects of nicotine. And I think that's really been a strong factor for women using cigarettes, because it helps you to keep the weight lower. It's not just that you don't walk to the refrigerator and pick out cookies. It's also that appetite is suppressed somehow by nicotine. And that's actually one reason why we use nicotine replacement therapy as doctors, as Anders described. You can prescribe nicotine replacement therapy. A good proof that it doesn't cause cancer, of course. Otherwise, I couldn't prescribe it as a doctor. But you can prescribe it because it helps against the weight increase that usually takes place when you stop smoking. Typically, you gain like 10 kilos, 20 pounds when you stop smoking. And part of that increase in body weight doesn't really occur if you give people nicotine replacement therapy, suggesting that it is appetite suppressing. So I did one of the very few, to my surprise, trials of the acute effects of nicotine on metabolic markers and hormones, that is insulin, glucose, and some other hormones I'll show you, in a very simple, to me as a scientist, setting. So I'm going to show you, this is the publication in Drug and Alcohol Dependence, which is a very high esteemed journal actually, that in which the trial was published. So this is the schematics of the trial, which is pretty simple. I had 14 subjects, 7 healthy women and 7 healthy men, and they were actually all medical students. So I had total control of it because I teach the medical students since many years. So, and that was the first really occasion that I became aware that there's so many young women studying medicine that use nicotine pouches, because we had to recruit people who used it to some extent, not to be vomiting by my trial. So the setup was pretty simple. They came in the morning, the 7 women and 7 men on separate occasions, of course, and we took all the baseline tests in the morning in the fasting state, and then after 1 hour we gave them a meal, which was actually a Big Mac together with a triple chocolate cookie, I think, because we wanted to assess the effects on glucose, so we needed to give them the glucose. These are skinny, fit medical students. So for something to happen with any of the hormones, you need to give them lots of sugar. They're always skinny. The medical students in Sweden, I tell you from 20 years of experience. So all 14 subjects then came 4 times. So I wanted to test the effects of nicotine in snus, and I also was interested in the effects of alcohol in red wine. So I did 2 tests at the same time. So to get after the baseline tests were taken, they all got snus under the lip. There was tobacco pouches, so and quite strong ones. It was like 11 milligrams of nicotine in each pouch. That is really strong. And that was replaced every hour So they got really lots of nicotine. But they also got 2 tests in which there was placebo pouches. So that's why we used pouches. So there was just some vegetables or something. I don't really know. So they got nicotine on 2 occasions under the lip, replaced every hour, and then placebo pouches on 2 other occasions, because it was also combined with that, together with a Big Mac and the triple chocolate cookie, they got 2 deciliters of real red wine on 2 occasions, and alcohol-free red wine on 2 other occasions. So I could test the effects of alcohol in red wine and nicotine in snus in the same setting. So everybody came 4 times. So there were 56 experiments. 4 times 14, you understand? And the neat thing with this from a statistical point of view is that since they came back 3 times, they served statistically as their own controls. And that gives you very high statistical power to detect differences, because they were compared with themselves from a statistical viewpoint. You get it? What happened to me compared to these different settings, with or without nicotine? So this will be quite fast to show, because not very much happened. So the open squares in these graphs is the nicotine, the time they had nicotine under the upper lip through snus or through tobacco pouches. And after 1 hour, they got this meal. And then, of course, it's compared to the occasion where they had no nicotine in the bloodstream. And the actual only thing that happened, so this is metabolic rate, which I'm very interested in, being a professor of internal medicine, in particular endocrinology. Metabolic rate you can measure by combustion of carbon dioxide and consumption of oxygen in a specific apparatus. It's very neat, actually. It's like checking out how much your car consumes by measuring how much carbon dioxide it puts out. You can do that in humans too. So I'll show you some more details of that in a while. But there was some small increase in the metabolic rate by nicotine. There were no changes in glucose. So it was very clear that there was no effects to cause reduced sensitivity to insulin by the nicotine. And I also studied insulin. There were no changes in insulin. I just don't show you all the graphs. The only real thing that happened, except that blood pressure increased some 4 millimeters of mercury by the nicotine, which is pretty much the same elevation as you get if you drink coffee. And coffee is not banned here, I think. It doesn't seem like that when we had breakfast, at least. Lots of coffee. So that's not very much, but I don't show you those graphs because that's so well known. The thing that we did find was that the stress hormone cortisol was slightly increased when you had nicotine in the bloodstream compared to control. Like 10%, as you might be able to deduct from this graph. And these are the area under the curves, and that was statistically significant, some 10%. And that is of interest, I think, because cortisol sharpens your mind. That's sort of a stress hormone that helps you to focus. And it's very well known when you give high doses of cortisol to patients, they get sort of alert, at least for a couple of weeks. Then they have some other poor metabolic effects. So those were pretty much the only differences we found. So very little. And this has not been tested before. It's so strange. So this really shows to me that there are very few metabolics, if any, relevant effects of a large dose of nicotine under your upper lip. So how would it be dangerous in the long run if there are so few acute effects? That's one thing that I've asked to people saying that nicotine is dangerous and they can't answer it. So I just put this in more detail. This was the first hour, as I said. Here were baseline testing, and here's when they get a meal. So in between here is just the effect of nicotine. And then I could show that if you compared, sorry for nicotine with a K and not with a C here, when you check everybody individual changes in the metabolic rate, there's actually an increase in the mean value here with a specific t-test that was not apparent when they had no nicotine. So it really was an effect of nicotine to increase metabolic rate, and that also would help to reduce body weight because you just waste energy by nicotine, which I found very interesting in more detail. And just to show you the strength of the trial, this is the effect of 2 parameters from the red wine. I don't know if that's not really the topic of today, but I can't help showing you that alcohol in red wine also increased metabolic rate. I mean, it's vasodilation, it causes some increased pulse, heart rate, so that could be an effect. But also, actually, we tested this appetite increasing hormone, ghrelin. Ghrelin makes you hungry, so it's lowered when you eat, but it was lowered further by alcohol in red wine. So perhaps it's good to allow at least red wine to meals together with nicotine. That's the Mediterranean diet, as you might know. So that was open square as well. So finally, as Anders touched upon, there is really already in Sweden trends or strong data that we have very low levels of ischemic heart disease. That's particularly in men, and again, it's men that has adopted this change first before the women to stop smoking and instead using snus. And of course, we have extremely low rates of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in Sweden. It's almost disappearing while people have stopped smoking. It's very interesting and very gratifying when you're a doctor to see that, because people just died from their smoking earlier on. And also we have some pretty convincing data that there is no increase in lip and oral cavity cancer by snus, as was claimed earlier on. No, there is not, and in particular not from more pure forms of nicotine. There is no such effect. It's not fermented tobacco in Swedish old snus, which they use in, for example, USA. And fermentation is probably not very good for the mucous membranes and so on, but we do not ferment our snus. So in summary, switching source of nicotine from smoking to using snus is an exceptional method for harm reduction on a population level, as seen in both Swedish and Norwegian examples and experiences. And nicotine per se, pure nicotine, is pretty much metabolically harmless. There was a small increase in blood pressure, about some 4 millimeters of mercury, which is pretty much the same as you get from drinking coffee or getting caffeine. And similarly to coffee, also there was this slight increase in cortisol, which could have been a part of a biofeel more focused and so on by nicotine. But the cortisol increase was not enough to reduce insulin sensitivity or to increase glucose. There were no such effects in my trial, even though I used strong snus replaced every hour with nicotine. And I also find interest in the fact that the metabolic rate increase, that could also be a part of helping people to lose weight when they use nicotine. And I can't help showing you this book that I've finished that's going to be released. It's a popular scientific book with scientific references that's going to be released in November or December. Lighten the load on your shoulders. And I have one dedicated chapter on the effects of nicotine with lots of scientific references in that. So that's an English popular scientific book that's going to be released in a couple of months. This is just a dust cover. Me trying to take pictures of birds because they don't ever get fat. Isn't that interesting? A bird that gets fat can't fly anymore. So, and there are such birds, of course, but the flying birds don't get fat. And I'm pretty poor at taking pictures of them, so I need a large lens. Yeah, I think that was my last topic.